Hey everyone, welcome to the Banh Mi Chronicles Podcast. This is an emergency episode, so the timestamp is Tuesday, October 7th, 6:04 p.m., and I am joined with Mahdis Azimi, who is an immigration attorney, and I want to shout out my good friend Nebula Lee, who introduced me to Mahdis
Yeah.
because right now I feel this is very important to get into kind of the weeds with the legal issues that are facing immigrants in Chicago as we speak, both for those that are undocumented and for those that have legal status. And Marisa, I would like for you to introduce more about the work that you do.
Sure. And of course, shout out to Nebula for connecting us. Um, my name is Mahdis Azimi, and I have been practicing immigration law for 10 years next month. Um, it flew by, it's been a little crazy. I started working for a nonprofit for a little while, and then I transitioned to working for two different smaller private firms. And I've actually been practicing on my own since 2019. And I work in immigration law. Um, most, not most, well, it might be most. A good chunk of immigration lawyers tend to work in private settings or solo practice settings, and some also work in nonprofits. And essentially, we have government attorneys who also work in immigration law, but they work on the prosecutorial side. I personally work in private immigration. I work on a variety of different matters, but a lot of the work I do involves removal defense and deportation defense for individuals who are in proceedings, whether they entered, yesterday or 20 years ago, green card holder or not. I just generally represent a lot of people in those proceedings. And as of recently, I've been going back and forth to immigration court a lot more than I used to.
Mm,
But I've always kind of settled into that area of practice.
mm. Thank you so much for sharing. And also, I want to offer a trigger warning that there's going to be conversations dealing with deportation and ICE raids. So, for
Yeah,
listeners, I ask that you be gentle with yourself as you're listening, and hopefully, this information will be very useful. And I want to say, Maris, like, I am very curious. Ever since Trump took office this year, and I know that it has
yeah.
escalated with the deportation issues, but what do you feel has change in terms of the current laws and the way proceedings are happening on deportations? Because I think that this is very different than when he first took office in 2017 versus now.
Definitely. I mean, I think for me, there were things that I expected, and there were things that really surprised me. I expected, based on my experience with the first administration, an uptick in detentions for sure. I didn't expect that it would be to this scale or with, ICE involvement, National Guard involvement. I also generally expected a lot of changes to be coming in quickly, because during the first administration, there were about 800 to 900 changes to immigration law and policy during the first Trump administration. But at this point, there's been so many changes. I heard a rumor at some point that this is actually more changes to immigration law and policy already. Um, but I'm not positive about that. I think something to really like keep in mind is the magnitude of everything. Um, for me, like what really shocked me when I started practicing again and after the inauguration was the sheer amount of people being detained, the sheer amount of like ICE presence, and I I think brutality is a strong word, but I mostly think say that because like I believe that the tactics that we've seen on sort of videos and photos have been extreme and far more violent and aggressive than I've ever seen from ICE officers. But I also know not everyone has been engaging in those particular tactics. So I do feel like there's definitely been an uptick in aggression and in some cases definitely brutality in terms of ICE detentions and how they proceed in the day-to-day context. And something that's really stood out for me is also, um, I think there used to be predictability in the sense of like when a client came to me and said, how can I guarantee that I won't be detained in prior
Mm,
administrations? I would say, we live in Chicago, we're a sanctuary city. CPD does not have the same kind of ICE holds in place that would require them to have someone detained shortly after release from like criminal arrest or detentions. But basically, I would tell clients, if you have something pending, if you don't have any arrest history, if you have, your documentation on you, in the past, I would say that is generally enough to keep you secure. But now it really is like there are no rules anymore.
mhm,
It's really started to feel like the wild, wild west in the sense that clients, maybe not necessarily just mine, but people are being detained with active cases, no arrest history, no issues whatsoever, or at least no issues that I would consider making them a priority for enforcement by ICE. And so that's been very intimidating and very scary, where a lot of people are very concerned, not because of just the fact that there's ICE present, but because of the fact that there's no real like criteria for who wouldn't be an enforcement priority. Feel like sometimes anyone's an enforcement priority. Even for myself, walking around as a citizen, I feel nervous sometimes walking into court because it just feels like we're walking into a place where we don't know what's going to happen or what it's going to look like. I mean, ICE has gone into immigration courts and detained people after their hearings. It's just a very different setting, a
Thank you.
different world. Yeah.
Yeah, that is incredibly jarring, and this is the reality that we are facing, and we're seeing ICE agents go very rogue and
Yeah.
going into places that they really aren't supposed to be at, but here we are. I mean, there's also
Yeah.
the warrantless
Searches.
searches, and I also wonder what has the response been from like the association, like the I can't even think of the right word at the
No
moment.
worries.
But yeah, like what has the collective response has been with lawyers in Illinois and Chicago, and also from the state and local government.
Yeah, I feel like we're very lucky, at least with, some of our main state and federal and local leadership in the sense that Illinois is a blue state and we live in Chicago. And for the most part, people have been in power, people in leadership have been very upset and very frustrated by the situations that have been taking place since January. And I do feel like we are privileged in general to live in an area like Chicago where uh, we are generally welcoming towards immigrants, but unfortunately, that has also led to more enforcement in Chicago.
Mm,
I do feel like the lawyer response has generally been very um, a lot of immigration lawyers that I know are definitely feeling a lot of pressure and stress and some signs of burnout. And I think that's pretty common, but we're very lucky. Like the American Immigration Lawyers Association and other private bar associations have really taken a stand against a lot of different immigration policy changes and process changes over the past few months. So that is a very fortunate thing for us. But I do feel like in some ways, my viewpoint of what other lawyers think is skewed. And I don't know if you notice this yourself too. I mean, I feel like I'm very fortunate in that I have a lot of colleagues and friends in this field, whether they're
mhm,
immigration lawyer or not, who are more progressive or more liberal or more anti-immigration enforcement to this extent. And so I do feel like fortunate for that, but I also recognize that I'm sure there are people in other parts of this country or even the state who are less supportive. I just feel
mhm,
very privileged to like be able to say that that's my personal experience and narrative.
mhm. Have you worked with clients outside of Chicago? And I'm also very curious about the dynamics in other cities and nearby towns adjacent to Chicago.
Sure, I've definitely worked with clients outside of Chicago, but For the most part, I did that during the first Trump administration. So I've represented clients in Texas, and I've especially worked in detained courts in Texas. I've had some hearings in New Mexico courts. I also have had clients in like California, for example, the New York, New Jersey area, and other parts of the Midwest or the Mideast. So a lot of cases in Michigan, as an
Mhm.
example. In some cases, sporadically, like in Louisiana, I've talked to people recently, on the Pacific Northwest. So the general theme, I think, is fear and strain and concern. Even for people who are in like safer or traditionally safer areas, there's been a lot of concern. Um, I think that's like the one universal factor for me that I've seen is that everyone is worried no matter where they are.
Mhm.
Um,
What steps have you been advising clients right now, especially in this very uncertain and dangerous time? What steps are you able to advise on what to do, especially in cases where maybe there's a final deportation order, maybe that there is a hearing that they have to go to, you know?
sure.
I'm very curious about like the pivots that you have to make and adjustments that you have to make to inform clients to make and protect themselves.
Sure. Some of the things that I've been advising are, keep copies of your ID or documentation on you, especially if you're traveling. Um, that from my client side, like as a practicing lawyer, when a client is concerned about detention, I say, if you have ICE at your door, do not open the door. If they have a warrant, they will let you know. But I always tell clients, text me, call me. I'm a solo practitioner, so sometimes my phone availability is a little funky,
Hmm.
for lack of a better word, depending on the day or if I'm in a hearing. But I've always told clients, I said, if ICE comes to your door, if you see them somewhere, like immediately let me know. But for the most part, keeping documentation handy, staying as vigilant as possible when going outside, checking ICE tracking apps. To be honest, I don't have them downloaded on my phone. I just trust communal like sharing in terms of seeing what my community is sending and letting people know. But definitely just advising people to lay low, let me know if they have any encounters with law enforcement, keep their documentation handy, and reach out if ICE comes near them or to their homes. And then, like a big shift I've seen is with people being detained in immigration courts. For the most part, clients in the past have never really hesitated to go to court. But lately, I've been seeing a lot of hesitation and fear about actually going to immigration court or going to immigration appointments. I feel that too. I mean, when I go, I'm worried that someone's going to be detained. That's the last thing I want for any client. I actually had a client detained in front of me during the first Trump administration. And even though we had some expectation that it could happen and we had prepared, it is a very intimidating and scary experience. And so I understand the hesitations, but there's definitely been a lot more pushback about, whether someone needs to go to court, if they're going to be detained, and a lot more fear in that sense.
Hmm.
And I've noticed that a lot of judges have been really gracious about allowing people to appear virtually, but there's still definitely a shift in attitudes about who's allowed to appear virtually.
Hmm. Wow, that is really important to also, know um, to be able to really share this. And I also wonder about what goes through when a client calls you that ICE is at their door.
Yeah.
What steps do you take when that happens?
Yeah. So it had happened in terms of like people being detained and contacting me after the fact, or working with the client and thinking, okay, maybe you'll be detained and having that experience of being prepared for that. Typically in advance, if I think someone's far more vulnerable, based on their position, I'll request certain documents to have on hand, and I'll inform clients that, and luckily when I'm working with someone already, I'll have a lot of these documents handy.
Mhm.
but essentially making sure that I have, like, in terms of my own firm safety planning, that we have what we would need to file a bare bones bond motion, an emergency bond motion, in case someone is detained, and we want to make sure we can get things going as quickly as possible.
Mhm.
But something that um, this was the first time it happened for me. I've always told clients, if ICE comes to your door, it's a true emergency and I will be there for you and we will figure out how to handle this. But I had never had that experience before this year where actually someone came to their door, and it's definitely a very sobering moment. Basically, he texted me. I immediately jumped on a phone, my client, when ICE came to his building trying to get into his apartment. And we talked about how he should not open the door, not answer the door, that if they had a warrant, we would request it. And we were on the phone a lot throughout that day. And even since then, it's been a few months.
Mhm.
But another thing that we did was we contacted ICE via email, and I explained to them, this is my client. This is the situation. In my opinion, he wasn't a priority for enforcement. So I didn't understand why ICE was there necessarily.
Mhm.
Um, but reaching out to the ICE office in Chicago via electronic mail or physical mail to explain to them, this person is represented. He's not alone in this. And, asking them to communicate with us if possible. And unfortunately, I didn't hear back from ICE ever in that certain circumstance.
Mhm.
ICE has come back and forth to this person's place of residence. But it's definitely a moment when you see it where you're like, oh, this is really an emergency. Like when I saw
Mhm.
that text message of, oh, ICE is at my door, uh, it really hit me that this is just a completely different world from what I'm used to.
Mhm.
Yeah.
When you when you have had to work with clients that are in detention centers, like Broadview, for example, which is now like
Yeah.
a which is a battle zone at the moment, with protesters being violently attacked. And I would like to kind of get your take on what has that experience been like working with the ICE detention centers when you have clients, I presume, that are being detained there.
So in general, and I try to be like fair to people when I can. I've generally had very kind officers at deportation centers. I haven't really done a lot of engagement with Broadview unless a client is actively being processed for deportation or removal. But for the most part, with the detention centers I've spoken with and worked with for various clients throughout the years, they've generally been very kind and helpful as much as they can be to make sure that the people who are inside have access to their counsel. It can be tough. I think more so in the past or depending on the center, because they're private facilities or like local facilities that have immigration detention as a part of their space or agreements. It's hard because each center is a very different experience and can provide very different resources. And I hate saying amenities because I feel like
Hmm.
that's not the right phrase or word for this situation, but some of them, for example, provide like texting options so that clients can still send messages to us or send messages to their
Hmm.
family and loved ones. Some of them allow for like video conferencing on iPads or other tablets. So, like, for the most part, the officers have been kind to me as an attorney trying to, represent my client.
Hmm.
Um, but I also still recognize that it's detention. And so I've had a lot of clients throughout the years tell me that, especially for those who have been in criminal detention or arrest or prisons before, sharing to me that this is a far worse circumstance to be in than whatever criminal jail or prison they were in before.
Hmm.
I find that because a lot of these institutions are privately owned or run, there aren't as many guarantees in terms of like day-to-day access to medical care, for example. And so that has been really challenging.
Hmm.
And talking to people who are detained, it's very sobering. I think about lockdown a lot when I think about like my experience inside waiting for people to be able to go active again. And I think that isolation and fear is really hard on a lot of clients. And so I've definitely had some conversations with people who are in detention that like do not leave my mind very easily.
Hmm.
Just things that make you really reflect on like how privileged we are um,
Hmm.
for the most part.
Yeah.
Like I remember leaving a detention facility in Texas a few years ago after seeing a client and just thinking, I get to go and sit in this room and watch TV and do whatever I need to do in this hotel after before going home and seeing my family and like being able to be out with other people and just thinking like from one person to the other, I no one really deserves to feel this alone
Mm-hmm.
and dehumanized.
Mm. I really appreciate you, sharing these stories and
Yeah.
also kind of giving a very important glance on what is happening to people being detained. And
Yeah.
there's been a lot of cases where people have been disappeared through ICE, and there's been situations where they're getting transported to different states and different places with
Yeah.
lawyers scrambling, family members scrambling to find out where their loved ones are being detained at. What can you share about what's going on with that, and maybe shed some light maybe into your experience of what you've heard from other colleagues in Illinois about situations like that? Because ICE again is going very rogue. I mean, they're certainly
Yeah.
turning the tables and accelerating to the point where it's hard for lawyers to catch up, and the courts, that is,
Yeah.
too. Mhm.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, it's I think the big thing for me that I always think about is the lack of information that we're given as practitioners. Like one would think in theory that a lawyer for someone would be informed every time their clients moved or, have like more information in advance than we actually get. I've been really lucky. I haven't really had clients move to places like Alligator Alcatraz, and I know there are a lot of people still missing and unaccounted for. I didn't have anyone sent to El Salvador to that prison or detention center there. I know someone who has, at least one person or one colleague. And for the most part, my clients who have been detained after, or sorry, before they became my client and not necessarily detained as my client, if that makes sense.
Mhm.
But it's definitely um, very scary to be left out in the dark and to not even know where your client is. I actually was on a virtual hearing for a different client a few months ago, and I was just listening in the background, and someone was talking about how um, for detained clients, for detained cases, typically in Chicago, what happens is we have people being video called from detention centers. They don't actually come up to Chicago courts to have their hearings. Those hearings are virtual for the people who are detained. And for us, depending on the judge, we either go in person or virtually. And I was sitting on a virtual call, a court call, um, listening, and someone from one detention center mentioned that a bunch of people had just been moved to another detention center in the Mideast. And I had another client in that center at the time, and that's how I learned she was moved. Like to me, it's just crazy that that's just how you learn someone has been moved. And because it was a different center, she couldn't call us, she couldn't text me like she normally would. I had to look it up and schedule a different call with her through a different center to talk to her and actually get into the details about why she was moved. And it makes it very hard to do our work, but
Mhm.
I feel very like again privileged and fortunate. I know how to
Mhm.
reach these people, I know how to find these resources, I'm on this call and I'm paying
Mhm.
attention and I'm aware of what's happening. But for people whose families may not have the same like internet savvy skills or tech skills or time during the workday,
Mhm.
it's definitely very frustrating and disheartening for people who are just being moved at the whims. And it's not even necessarily for a bad reason. Like, for example, there they were saying it's overcrowding. We want to move people so they have more space, which is a safety concern. but there's no communication. I mean, I know someone who had a client moved to El Salvador. That client was supposed to have a hearing coming up in a few days, and he had no notice whatsoever that his client had been moved. He had to know because he was looking and checking online and he couldn't find the status of his client.
Mm,
And I should elaborate, there's something called the ICE detainee locator. So there's a way to check if someone is being detained or if they're detained in a particular place. There's some information you'll need, like place of birth, date of birth, full legal name,
mhm,
things like that. So there are ways to find someone, but if someone's en route to another facility, you're not going to see any status updates for them, really.
mm,
You'll be told to call the ICE office in Chicago, and then that office will, if you're lucky, maybe pick up a handful out of 100 times
mm, mm.
calling.
What
Yeah.
has what have or what are you seeing from Chicago in terms of their response of I know you had earlier talked about this, but I definitely want to like go back to that question.
Yeah.
What have they been able to advise with you? Like what policy, what are they trying to do to slow down the national government's involvement? Now, I know we got the National Guard coming over to Chicago from Texas and
Sure.
Illinois being activated. I am wondering what could the state actually do, especially in this situation, and how can it, in a way, or how can they, in a ways, try to prevent immediate deportations and detainment?
I think in terms of what the state can do, it of course is really challenging because they're up against the federal government. But I think that in terms of our like governor and our mayor and our leadership, we do have this like fortunate position of having leadership that is very active and involved in making sure that people are informed, that immigration services are accessible, and working to, for example, file a lawsuit to prevent the National Guard from coming to Chicago or Illinois in general. And in terms of, you know, what I think people are doing in the community. I love that, storefronts and shopkeepers and people in the community are just shooting pictures and telling the people in their communities, ICE is here at this intersection or in this
Hmm.
neighborhood. Be careful, watch
Yeah.
out. I just feel like as a community,
Hmm.
not just lawyers and legal organizations,
Hmm.
because a lot of our legal organizations are doing great things to get the word out.
Hmm.
I just
Hmm.
feel like there is a lot of community support that
Yeah.
I forget his last name. But I think it was the CBP director when he was talking about how like Chicago is very prepared, and that's why it's made it so difficult for ICE to meet their
Hmm.
targets or for CBP to meet their targets in Chicago
Hmm.
for detention. I think that says a lot about how, as a society, we have decided that this is not acceptable to us. And I'm
Hmm.
glad we have government officials that represent those views too.
I think that's really important because this is something that I'm very proud of with Chicago, and I say this with clear and unapologetic bias because
Yeah,
it's a city that has been a progressive bastion for so long. Black and Latino, Asian, those community members have really been known to activate and be very vigilant about their communities. And I think that's very important. And I'm also like very encouraged when I start seeing storefronts also telling them not to use our bathroom. We're not going to serve you.
yeah,
And you know what? I think that is just another inconvenient way of trying to distract and make things very difficult. And I will just say that because I know you're in the legal background,
yeah.
so I'm going to be very careful about how I share my own
Oh,
hot
that's
takes.
okay.
But I do think that community support has to be amplified, and I feel like the work that you're doing, what legal organizations, firms is like really trying to protect people and getting
Yeah,
proper legal representation, and also trying to document what is happening in these detention centers and how they're being abducted. And I think
yeah,
this is something that we really have to name. Like these are abductions and forced disappearances. And I think that has to be part of the lexicon in how we describe this. This is not just a typical routine, you know. And I also, there are people that will say, well, Biden has done it, Obama has done it. Yes.
Yeah.
Like, let's be very honest. Like, that has happened under those administrations. But with the Republicans, specifically with the Trump administration, that has escalated to another level, but also going after US citizens. Um, have you had situations where you've had clients or other people or other lawyers have had clients having to represent even US citizens that are being detained?
I definitely have heard of it. I personally haven't, and I'm
Mm,
so glad I haven't had clients who are US citizens who have been detained. But I think it is a very sobering thing. And I think it says a lot about how brazen everything has become. Like for me, I criticize this country and politics a lot. I try to be a little bit more diplomatic about it sometimes, and especially when I'm working in environments where I'm not the boss, essentially, you know. And especially like when working with government officers, for like, for example, when I go to a government appointment, I try to be mindful that we all have jobs to do, and that in most circumstances, it's best for me to be cordial and cooperative and work with an officer. And I've had a lot of good case wins recently. But I think, and I've criticized many a president, Democrat or Republican, but for me, like the thing that I've seen that's really different with this presidency and this administration is how brazen and open people have been about like othering people and profiling others. I mean, even the Supreme Court rubber stamping racial profiling in LA.
mhm,
And I feel very lucky that I haven't had any citizen clients detained.
mhm,
Um, but I know that people are scared and very aware of their privilege or lack of privilege and how they present in the world. Not just people of color, like working in the immigration sphere, but also like friends who are, for example, like LGBTQIA plus, like identifying in that sense. And I
mhm,
even feel nervous on the street. I
mhm,
know like I speak generally unaccented English, and I'm out in the world as a citizen who was born here. But
mhm,
I actually, and I haven't talked about it a lot, but my parents a few months ago actually texted me and they said, so like if you're detained, who helps you? I'm like, can you send us the phone number? Because my parents are, um, like immigrant
mhm,
parents, very concerned, want to make sure I'm
mhm,
okay. Didn't really know a lot of lawyers before I went to law school.
mhm,
And I just think that says a lot about like the rate at which people are being detained when they have every right to due process and to be out in the world, moving exactly how they are. And I think it's just very, very sad that there are not just citizens being detained, but people who are scared about detention,
mhm.
who have like all the privileges that we would think would keep them safe.
What can you share to community allies as far as like what do you think would be best ways to support your clients, support your work? I think this is I always am a believer that we all need find ways to support people really doing the essential work in this, and lawyers are definitely front people on the front lines. And I would like to see how you would like to share about your thoughts on the community's involvement and what it means and how they can help to amplify and support this important work.
Yeah, I mean, I think in terms of like what we are seeing in Chicago, I think it is amazing already. And I would say, for the most part, to keep doing what we're doing, keep videoing when people are getting stopped. And when you see something is going on that's not right or not sitting right with you, keep protesting and keep advocating for equality and humanity. And, in a private setting, it's very different because I recognize that I'm being compensated directly for the work I'm doing. But I would also say, to think about like the various immigration organizations in our communities. If someone's trying to like physically donate, because, and not just attorneys, but community activists and organizing as well. Because I think there are some bigger organizations, but there are also a lot of smaller scale organizations that do very good work that's very meaningful. There are also organizations and bar associations like the National Lawyers Guild that provide legal observing. And I think those groups are instrumental in helping with community support and sharing widespread information and giving trainings about people's rights during ICE detention or stops. And I would also, honestly, I think the biggest thing I would say to do that isn't necessarily being done on a widespread scale is for people to actually um, observe hearings if they can, to come to the courts, to come to these spaces where people are being um, targeted, whether you're incidentally, for example, at a school where ICE is trying to enter, or if you're going to the courthouse to observe hearings and to make sure people's rights are being protected. Um, I think when we stand up for each other, we really help bolster people's, um, I'm sorry, I'm losing the word right now, but I know what I'm trying to get at, which is that it is so meaningful to people when they
Hmm.
see others showing up for them. And I
Hmm.
think it just shows the strength in our humanity when we treat people with respect for existing, not because of any particular actions. Like, I think when people tell ICE, no, you can't come into this school or
Hmm.
hospital to detain this person, it's a very scary thing to sit there and say, like, we're going to push against the government, the force of law.
Hmm.
But it shows other people that their lives have value, not just to the people who know them, but to their communities.
Hmm. I really appreciate this because I think that this is how we build momentum. It's how we
Yeah,
build momentum to recognize that yes, ICE is not welcome here. And even though the work that I do puts me in danger, you know, doing this and also for you and everyone
yeah,
else getting involved with it, I also feel like this is the time. I think
yeah,
that it's like speak now or forever hold your peace. And
yeah,
that forever hold your peace is basically a enforced one. And
yeah,
it's hard for me to wrestle with that conscious, like this really upsetting consciousness that's been really at me for the last few weeks,
yeah,
seeing what's going on and how can I help to amplify that. And I feel that bringing people like yourself on is vital because I think bringing this information to communities that do not know the full narratives of what's going on because mainstream legacy media are not really covering it. And if
yeah,
they are covering it, it's done in a very different level, if I'm going to be very honest about it. Um,
yeah.
and I think it's important to have um, hyper local journalists, and I think that's also very important for them to tell these stories. And so I really do encourage folks to really share stories, to start a podcast or do TikToks. I mean, because it's because the fringe narratives from the right wing have been infiltrating, and I
Yeah,
think our role is to intercept them, but also to create the narratives that are coming from our community's voices. And I think that what you're doing is very vital. So I really am so thankful for you on that. How do you and your colleagues take care of yourselves, like, and each other, like in a collective care level on this?
oh yeah. I mean, I can't necessarily speak for everyone, but I do know that some of my colleagues are doing these same things. So like I'll speak for myself with the understanding that some other people are also using these tools. I go to therapy all the time. I've
Hmm.
been going to I know you and I had talked about this a little bit before, but I regularly see a therapist.
Hmm.
And I think it's important, not just if you're a lawyer or in a lawyer in a hot field, but for anyone, I think it has taught me a lot about myself and like how I process stress and also helped me work through a lot of strain and
Hmm.
actually see someone private, but I also see someone through an organization that we have called the Lawyers Assistance Program that provides free services to attorneys and law students
Mm-hmm.
in the state. And I feel incredibly grateful to have that support, both like from a therapeutic sense and
Mm-hmm.
from like a communal sense as well.
Mm-hmm.
And I try to stay as active as I can, even if it's just taking a walk. I try to do things that bring me joy.
Mm-hmm.
And I try to limit the news as much as I can. I'm not very good at it. I
Mm-hmm.
read a lot of news. I stay on social media. I doom scroll on X, um, because I find that it does provide a lot of like news that I don't see elsewhere.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think staying informed to a point helps me feel more in control. And I know some people might have their anxiety fueled, especially some of my colleagues, but for me, when I know what's to be expected, I feel more secure. But I think, and this is something that I think is like the benefit of getting older
Mm-hmm.
or growing up a bit more. I think during the first administration, I felt for the Trump administration, I felt so much more stress and inability to manage that stress and how it
Mm-hmm.
affected me in other parts of my life. Um, but I feel like the benefit of seeing so much happen between 2020 and now is that this too shall pass. I don't know how or when. I hope it's in, you know,
Mm-hmm.
selfishly and personally, I hope it's in less than 3-ish years.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but it will pass. We will get through it. Like I feel very strongly about that. So I think that's something that like helps me get through
Mm-hmm.
the day and take care of myself is the recognition that things do change and evolve. And just because this is our reality now doesn't mean that it's going to be a reality forever. And so I do know a lot of my colleagues do similar things, go to therapy, take care of themselves, speak to others within
Mm-hmm.
our field and outside of that. Um, but I, well, we have Facebook groups and social media groups where we're able to exchange thoughts and like connect with each other across the country. But I also just feel like connecting with community has been very helpful and actually getting
Mm-hmm.
to speak with friends and family. And
Mm-hmm.
um, that has kept me sane for a very long time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What should you, what advice would you give to folks that are worried about their legal status and that do not currently have legal representation? What steps should they consider taking, and especially if they are low income in this case? So
Sure.
I'd like to kind of, open that floor up on what people can do.
Sure. I mean, fortunately, we do have a lot of organizations in Illinois that provide legal services and immigration services. But what I would really recommend is that people um, get things like powers of attorney or guardianship paperwork in place. Um, reach out to different organizations or even friends of friends. Like I have classmates that I maybe talk to like every year or so from law school who reached out and they just said, so and so is worried. I know them. Can they call you if they have any concerns, even if they can't necessarily hire you? And I think something that I've been trying to be more proactive about is saying yes, like anyone in my network, if something is going on and something is happening to them, I do want to give them advice. These things that we learn in our own professional backgrounds are
Mhm.
not just things that we're learning in a vacuum. They're things that we can share with others. And so, like, I'm trying to remember that one benefit to having this knowledge is that I have this knowledge and experience, and I can use that to help people, even though they're not a traditional client. With some like limitations, of course, because, as attorneys, we have to make it clear, like, is this legal advice? Is this privileged? What are we doing and what are we providing? But just trying to be more proactive is something that I've been trying to work on and that I recommend. So, like, for example, say you're someone who has no um, attorney, can't really afford traditional legal services, on the wait list for a nonprofit or pro bono attorney. and you already have this paperwork in place that provides some security, especially if you're in a mixed status family. Just reaching out to people and even saying, like, I've had friends who reach out to me on Instagram and they say so and so is looking for an attorney. We don't really know them, but they need help. Can you give some advice? And I think, like, when we're vulnerable and we tell people we need help, yes, it can be scary, but I've been able to connect with some people through, several degrees of separation,
Mm.
um, and actually been able to inform them and talk to them and give some advice and learn from them as well. And I think that can be really helpful, even if you don't have the means to get a normal or traditional attorney.
Mhm. What about those that are undocumented or have DACA status? What's that
Uh,
route like for them in terms of legal representation versus those with legal status or a legal status is in jeopardy?
Yeah. So luckily right now DACA, USCIS, or like Citizenship and Immigration Services, did say that they're going to start processing DACA cases and
Mhm.
applications for initial applications for people who are outside of Texas based on like a court case that came up a few months ago. But what I would say for people with, like, for example, DACA is make sure you're maintaining your status. If you don't have an attorney, consider retaining someone or working with a nonprofit. But if you don't have one, it's understandable that you may not have the means. But and I hate saying this because I think people can be in like wrong places at the wrong times, or our immigration laws specifically don't really give room for people to have the luxury of making a dumb
Mm.
mistake, for lack of a better like
Yeah,
way of explaining it. And
yeah.
I hate to say this, but telling people to like be as cautious as possible. Um, on one hand, you have to live your life and be the person that you are, go to work, be with your family, be with your friends. But on the other hand, unfortunately, we are seeing people get stopped at traffic stops,
Hmm.
getting detained, just going to work. But being as cautious as possible and being mindful to the extent that you can to make sure that you're in a situation where, even though you can't predict if you're going to be a target for enforcement by immigration authorities, kind of maintaining or minimizing the risk as much as possible, which I hate that we're putting the onus on
Right,
clients at times, but the
right.
reality is that we can't control the government, but we can control how we act. Like, I don't leave without my global entry card saying that I'm a citizen. I don't leave the house without that in my wallet, because I know that's a very small scale like way of maintaining control, but I don't leave without it because I don't want to be caught without it. Um, I don't want to create more room for like confusion. Say, like, if I see an ICE officer on the street who looks at me and thinks, oh, like dark hair, not traditional view of what an American person would look like. I try to minimize that. And I advise clients, like, even if it's just carrying your documentation, that's something I recommend.
Hmm.
And having more grace with people. Like, I teach a course, a seminar every week. Um, and with some of the students, I said, I don't know if you have status concerns, because I don't. I really don't. And I don't ask. I just look at them as a human being in my class that I'm engaging with and that I care for. But I've told them, I said, I keep an eye on things. If things are crazy, I'm going to move to virtual course
Hmm.
settings so that we don't have to be at more risk than we already are. And unfortunately, for people who are undocumented, it is really hard to advise in a situation where it seems like anyone could be a target for enforcement.
Hmm.
But recommending, seeking advice as much as they can if they think they have some options for relief, and similar advice of, trying to minimize any risk as much as they can, with the understanding that people still need to go outside, make livings, be with others in community, go to houses of worship. Like, there's only so much we can do as people, but if we can control as much as we can from our ends, hopefully we'll be able to keep each other safe.
Mm.
Yeah.
I want to say Thank you so much for coming on to my show at the last minute. Thank you to Nebula for bringing us
Yeah.
together. And I want to say thank you so much for sharing the wisdom, your experience in the legal profession on this. I think what you and so many immigration attorneys across the US are doing is so vital to the lives of so many people. And in a time where we are dealing with so much uncertainty and fear, I do have some reassurances when I look at people like yourself, folks that are actually standing up for community members. And I think this is a really good reminder that yes, while things are very dire right now, and things could obviously change in 48 hours, I also am a full believer that we as a community can really work to withstand and also to really make things difficult for the powers that be that are trying to destroy communities. So really from the bottom of my heart, really thank you so much for being on. I don't know if you have any closing remarks too before we close off.
Yeah. In terms of like closing remarks, I just, especially over the past year and a half, I've realized how important community is to me and how much it not only like gives me joy, but also makes me feel safe and secure in my position in the world and with my identities. And like I don't think I could have gotten through when I think about like, coming up to 10 years in practice. I could not have gotten through these 10 years without the people in my life, like Nebula, who connected us, but other
Mhm.
people too, family, friends, colleagues. Um, and I think my best advice or like closing remarks is something I've been doing lately, not just like in the immigration context, but sometimes I send it to clients too. Um, when I think of someone, I reach out to them and I see how they're doing. This is like a tough time for so many people, not just immigration related. And I think if you're wondering, like, not just yourself or myself, but if you're just out in this world and you're thinking, I wonder how this person is doing, are they okay? Anytime someone reaches out to me, it feels like an outpouring of love and
Mm,
support. Even if it's just like a small message of, how are you? I'm thinking of you during this time for this reason. And I would just say, like, there's no step too small. Just sending a message and saying, like, I'm supporting you today
mm,
is such a wonderful thing. And I think it's great, like, to see like large scale actions and protests, but I just wouldn't underestimate the power of like a small act too.
Thank you so much. And best of luck to you and your clients in navigating through this uncertainty and keep
Thank you.
up the wonderful work.
Thank you. I appreciate it. And same to you. I got to listen to some of your episodes today when I was
Thank you.
working. So it was cool to learn about other things that you've been focusing on. So
Thank
yeah.
you.
Yeah.